Chapter 9. The Story of Eden. The whole Bible and the whole history of the world, past, present, and future, are contained in embryo in the story of Eden, for they are nothing else than the continuous unfolding of certain great principles which are there allegorically stated. That is by no means a new notion is shown by the following quotation from Origen. Who is there so foolish and without common sense as to believe that God planted trees in the Garden of Eden like a husbandman, and planted therein the tree of life perceptible to the eyes and to the senses, which gave life to the eater, and another tree which gave to the eater a knowledge of good and evil? I believe that everybody must regard these as figures under which a recondite sense is concealed. Let us then follow up the suggestion of this early father of the Church and inquire what may be the recondite sense concealed under this figure of the two trees. On the face of the story there are two roots, one of life and the other of death, two fundamental principles bringing about diametrically opposed results. The distinctive mark of the latter is that it is knowledge of good and evil, that is to say, the recognition of two antagonistic principles, and so requiring a knowledge of the relations between them to enable us to continually make the needful adjustments to keep ourselves going. Now in appearance this is exceedingly specious. It looks so entirely reasonable that we do not see its ultimate destructiveness. And so we are told that Eve ate the fruit because she saw that the tree was pleasant to the eyes. But careful consideration will show us in what the destructive nature of this principle consists. It is based on the fallacy that good is limited by evil, and that you cannot recognize any good except through eliminating the corresponding evil by realizing it and beating it back. In this view, life becomes a continual combat against every imaginable form of evil. And after we have racked our brains to devise precautions against all possible evil happenings, there remains the chance, and much more than the chance, that we have by no means exhausted the category of negative possibilities, and that others may arise which no amount of foresight on our part could have imagined. The more we see into this position, the more intolerable it becomes, because from this standpoint we can never attain any certain basis of action, and the forces of possible evil multiply as we contemplate them. To set forth to outwit all evil by our own knowledge of its nature is to attempt a task that hopelessness of which becomes apparent when we see it in its true light. The mistake is in supposing that life can be generated in ourselves by an intellectual process. But as we have seen in the preceding lectures, life is the primary movement of the spirit, whether in the cosmos or in the individual. In its proper order, intellectual knowledge is exceedingly important and useful, but its place in the order of the whole is not that of the originator. It is not life in itself, but is a function of life. It is an effect and not the cause. The reason why this is so is because intellectual study is always the study of the various laws which arise from the different relations of things to one another, and therefore presupposes that these things together with their laws are already in existence. Consequently, it does not start from the truly creative standpoint, that of creating something entirely new, creation ex nihilo, as distinguished from construction, or the line together of existing materials, which is what the word literally means. To recognize evil as a force to be reckoned with is therefore to give up the creative standpoint altogether. It is to quit the plane of first cause and descend into the realm of secondary causation, and lose ourselves amid the confusion of a multiplicity of relative causes and effects, without grasping any unifying principle behind them. Now the only thing that can release us from the inextricable confusion of an infinite multiplicity is the realization of an underlying unity, and at the back of all things we find the presence of one great affirmative principle without which could nothing have existed. This then is the root of life, and if we credit it with being able not only to supply the power, but also the form for its manifestation, we shall see that we need not go beyond this single power for the production of anything. It is spirit producing substance out of its own essence, and the substance taking form in accordance with the movement of the spirit. What we have to realize is not only that this is the way in which the cosmos is brought into existence, but also that, because the spirit finds a new center in ourselves, the same process is repeated in our own mentality, and therefore we are continually creating ex nihilo, whether we know it or not. Consequently, if we look upon evil as a force to be reckoned with, and therefore requiring to be studied, we are in effect creating it. While on the other hand, if we realize that there is only one force to be considered, and that of absolutely good, we are, by the law of creation, bringing that good into manifestation. No doubt for this affirmative use of our creative power, it is necessary that we start from the basic conception of a single originating power, which is absolutely good and life-giving. But if there were a self-originating power which was destructive, then no creation could ever come into existence at all. For the positive and negative self-originating powers would cancel each other and the result would be zero. The fact, therefore, of our own existence is a sufficient proof of the singleness and goodness of the originating power. And from this starting point, there is no second power to be taken into consideration. And consequently, we do not have to study the evil that may arise out of existing or future circumstances, but require to keep our minds fixed only upon the good which we intend to create. There is a very simple reason for this. It is that every creation necessarily carries its own law with it, and by that law produces new conditions of its own. A balloon affords a familiar illustration of my meaning. The balloon with its freight weighs several hundredweight, yet the introduction of a new factor, the gas, brings with it a law of its own which entirely alters the condition, and the force of gravity is so completely overcome that the whole mass rises into the air. The law itself is never altered, but we have previously known it only under limiting conditions. These conditions, however, are no part of the law itself, and the clear realization of the law shows that it contains in itself the power of transcending them. The law which every new creation carries with it is therefore not a contradiction of the old law, but its specialization into a higher mode of action. Now the ultimate law is that of production ex nihilo, by the movement of the spirit within itself. And all subordinate laws are merely the measurements of the relations which spontaneously arise between different things when they are brought into manifestation. And therefore, if an entirely new thing is created, it must necessarily establish entirely new relations, and so produce entirely new laws. This is the reason why, if we take the action of pure unmanifested spirit as our starting point, we may confidently trust it to produce manifestations of law which, though perfectly new from the standpoint of our past experience, are quite as natural in their own way as any that have gone before. It is on this account that in these addresses I lay so much stress on the fact that spirit creates ex nihilo, that is, out of no pre-existing forms, but simply by its own movement within itself. If then this idea is clearly grasped, it logically flows from it that the root of life is not to be found in the comparison of good and evil, but in the simple affirmation of the spirit as the all-creating power of good. And since, as we have already seen, this same all-creating spirit finds a center and fresh starting point of operation in our own minds, we can trust it to follow the law of its own being there as much as in the creation of the cosmos. Only we must not forget that it is working through our own minds. It thinks through our mind, and our mind must be made a suitable channel for this mode of its operation by conforming itself to the broad, generic lines of the Spirit's thinking. The reason for this one, which I have sought to impress throughout these lectures, namely, that the specialization of a law is never the denial of it, but on the contrary, the fuller recognition of its basic principles. And if this is the case in ordinary physical science, it must be equally so when we come to specialize the great law of life itself. The spirit can never change its essential nature as the essence of life, love, and beauty. And if we adopt these characteristics, which constitute the law of the spirit, as the basis of our own thinking, and reject all that is contrary to them, then we afford the broad generic conditions for the specialized thinking of the spirit through our own minds. And the thinking of the spirit is that involution, or passing of spirit into form, which is the whole being of the creative process. The mind which is all the time being thus formed is our own. It is not a case of control by an external individuality, but the fuller expression of the universal through an organized mentality, which has all along been a less perfect expression of the universe. And therefore the process is one of growth. We are not losing our individuality, but are coming into fuller possession of ourselves by the conscious recognition of our personal share in the great works of creation. We begin in some slight measure to understand what the Bible means when it speaks of our being partakers of the divine nature, and we realize the significance of the unity of the Spirit. Doubtless this will imply changes in our old mode of thinking, but these changes are not forced upon us. They are brought about naturally by the new standpoint from which we now see things. Almost imperceptibly to ourselves we grow into a new order of thought which proceeds not from a knowledge of good and evil, but from the principle of life itself. That is what makes the difference between our old thought and our new thought. Our old thought was based upon a comparison of limited facts. Our new thought is based upon a comprehension of principles. The difference is like that between the mathematics of an infant, who cannot count beyond the number of apples or marbles put before him, and that of a senior wrangler who is not dependent upon visible objects for his calculations, but plunges boldly into the unknown because he knows that he is working by indubitable principles. In like manners, when we realize the infallible principle of the creative law, we no longer find we need to see everything cut and dried beforehand. For if so, we could never get beyond the range of our old experiences. But we can move steadily forward because we know the certainty of the creative principle by which we are working, or rather which is working through us, and that our life, in all its minute details, is its harmonious expression. Thus the Spirit thinks through our thought only its thought in greater than ours. It is the paradox of the less continuing the greater. Our thought will not be objectless or unintelligible to ourselves. It will be quite clear as far as it goes. We shall know exactly what we want to do and why we want to do it, and so will act in a reasonable and intelligent manner. But what we do not know is the greater thought, that is the all the time giving rise to our smaller thought form, and which will open out from it as our lesser thought progresses into form. Then we gradually see the greater thought, which prompted our smaller one, and we find ourselves working along its lines, guided by the invisible hand of the creative spirit, into continually increasing degrees of livingness to which we need to assign no limits. For it is the expansion of the infinite within ourselves. This, as it appears to me, is the hidden meaning of the two trees in Eden, the garden of the soul. It is the distinction between a knowledge which is merely that of comparisons between different sorts of conditions, and a knowledge which is that of life, which gives rise to and therefore controls conditions. Only we must remember that the control of conditions is not to be attained by violent self-assertion, which is only recognizing them as a substantive entity to be battled with, but by conscious unity with that all-creating spirit, which works silently but surely on its own lines of life, love, and beauty. Not by might, not by power, but by my Spirit, saith the Lord of hosts. End of chapter.